Thank you all for coming. Absolute pleasure. I hope you've been enjoying the conference so far. What we're going to be doing today is we're going to be looking at status and power as a tool for kind of looking at characters and things. What I'll do is I'll do my best to keep up with the chat and answer questions as we go. But what I'll start with is doing a bit of an information download, and then there should be plenty of time at the end to do some questions and some sharing, simply because an hour is a long time to talk, even for someone like me. So I'm sure we'll have plenty of time to chat through. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Phoebes or Phoebe, and I write with the Obsidian Fleet. I've also got some subtitles going today for anyone who finds that helpful when listening to this kind of stuff. And my background is I have a drama degree. And basically, it's done me zero good in earning money. So I thought I'd use it today instead to kind of look at character development, because I think, and I've talked a bit about this with Emu on a Let's Obsidian Fleetcast, Let's Write podcast before. But I think that actually creating theatre and writing are basically the same thing. They're just different ways of telling stories. So I think a lot of the same rules apply. And so that's where we're going to start. Some of the theory is particularly based on Chekhov, but it's probably not the Chekhov you're thinking of. So it's not the Chekhov from the Enterprise, and it's also not the Chekhov with the gun. So it's his nephew, so a guy called Michael Chekhov. And so basically, status versus stasis. So why is status important in storytelling is a really good good place to start. So what we're always trying to avoid doing when we're doing this kind of storytelling is reaching a kind of a plateau where the plot kind of drops and the energy from the story drops. And one great way to kind of inject a bit of dramatic tension into your story is to look at power between characters and power exchanges. So you'll all heard the phrase the pecking order before. And basically all social creatures begin with and operate with a kind of hierarchy, and the pecking order is what happens with chickens. So when you're having when they're all gathered around and looking for the same resource, they peck at each other. Birds do it on bird feeders, and people do it in boardrooms all around the world. And whether or not we kind of accept it, like it, welcome hierarchy, what we do know is that status and hierarchy and power play a really important part in social groups. And as one of the most successful social species, that applies to humans as well. So obviously humans are vastly more complex than chickens, but because we have those kind of social cues that we're looking for in group dynamics and in personal interactions with people, our brains are keyed to look for them. And so if we can find ways to introduce them into our story, it just is a really great way to grab people's attention and to kind of use it as a springboard for something happening. And in particular, that's very interesting when power exchanges hands. So many theatre practitioners look at how power works between characters on stage. And you can also see it in lots of different types of books and stories. And probably you will all have good examples of where you have written character power exchange, even if you haven't thought about it in these terms before. So one practitioner to do this, as I said before, is Chekhov. It's Michael Chekhov, the nephew of the famous Anton Chekhov with the gun. And he really emphasizes that body and mind are linked. And what's interesting about that is that while that seems really obvious now, and we would easily say, yes, of course, body language tells us about what someone's thinking. In the 20th century, when he was writing, that was less kind of common thinking. It was just at that point in the century where psychologists were starting to say, actually, the external presentation of a person says something about their internal landscape. So now we know that, and science is more leading towards this sense that often things happen in the body first, and that can influence our minds, but and not the other way around. Which, if you're a fellow control freak like me, is a nightmare. But useful to think about into when we're describing, in particular, people's body language when we're writing. So much about power and status, as we'll unpick in just a moment, is about how people present themselves in the world. um, Sorry, I'm already reading Chris. Not as complex as a chicken. I wouldn't want to comment. And you don't have to give up any power as part of this session, but it might encourage you to think about the relationship differently. Um, so I'll skip over this theatre nerd bit, but I'll post the PowerPoint for anyone who's super interested in a bit more of the detailed theory. But basically, this is just pulling from people like Chekhov, Stanislavski, Brecht, and But I would say if you start going down a rabbit hole on the internet, please do take this with a bit of a like pretension warning, because obviously, like all theatre, sometimes it can be oh a bit like, oh, okay, that's a bit too far. It's kind of a bit removed from reality sometimes, but in there is some really good stuff. So what are we talking about when we talk about power and status? So I like to break it down into the three different types of status and power. So the first is formal power. And if this is for things like Star Trek and military sims, really, really obvious, right? This will be the first thing that you think of when you think of power. So this is the kind of power that's given to you by the role that you play, your job, your title, your position on the ship. It tends to be relatively static. So unless the kind of something very significant happens or someone gets a new job, their formal power would remain relatively the same, as long as they're operating within the setting that gives them that formal power. Um, so if you think about it as things like rank, it will also come with the ability to persuade and influence people within the boundaries of your role. So another way to think of high status characters are characters that can influence the situation and the people around them. And low status characters are characters that are influenced by the situation around them. They have to work a lot harder to have the same level of influence as a high status character, and probably will have a less effective result. Um, so it could also play out, you might see formal power play out in the ability to make decisions or veto negotiations unilaterally. It's the most obvious thing we think of. So a good example coming from pop culture would be, I don't know if anyone's seen Hamilton, but obviously as a as a drama nerd, gotta love a bit of a musical. I would say that the King George songs in Hamilton are such an excellent example of how to choreograph high status in terms of body language, and also just the like everything about the costume, the presence. So it's worth a watch. In terms of Star Trek, I know a lot of people here write in Star Trek sims. You're looking at your chain of command is your example of formal power, and you could also look at entities like the Q. Something uh, beings where their like it's more than just their own person or the group around them that gives them power. They just unilaterally have power given to them by the nature of their role in the cosmos. And then the next one is informal power. So this is the kind of the power that's given to you by your friends and family, by your co-workers. It's based on a set of attributes which the social group find really valuable. So if you think about this one as being a much more changeable power, you can influence people outside of your role. So you might have someone on your lower decks, for example, who is just very charismatic, very persuasive, has a very good education. And these are the kind of things that would uh, contribute towards someone's informal power. Usually it's based on your ability also to carry out specialized tasks. um, so things like your engineers, for example, might have a lot of informal power. So they might not be the highest ranking person on the bridge, but there are going to be certain situations where everyone will defer to them because of their specialist knowledge. Um, the other interesting thing, and I think when we're looking at power and status as a storytelling tool, informal power can overwhelm, undermine, or influence formal power. So, as I just said with the engineering example, there are times where informal power, the power given to you by your peers, will trump the chain of command. Um, and I think this is where, as writers in Sims, we can have a lot of fun playing with this kind of dynamic. Good examples might be characters like the jester who speaks truth to the king, or in Star Trek you could think about people like Dr. McCoy or Seven of Nine, Geordie LaForge. These are all people who aren't necessarily the highest ranking person on the ship, well, except for maybe you could argue Dr. McCoy, because he can override Kirk's decisions in certain situations. But because of their specialist knowledge, people will defer to them in certain situations. And then the last one, which is the one which is very interesting, I have found to explore on an individual level when you're looking at character creation, is personal power. So this is the kind of, so if the other two are types of power and status that are given to you by the external world around you, personal power is what we give ourselves. It's the things that make up our personality and that define our identity, that kind of give us a sense of resilience and confidence. And these might be things like physical health and well-being. So, if you've got a character who is differently abled, that might have an effect on the level of power and influence that they have in certain situations. And it might give them more resilience in some situations as well. Um, Also, things like emotional acuity. So, how does someone handle their emotions? A character's religious or faith convictions, their cultural background, their beliefs, their confidence, and personal values or experience. So, like a really good example would be things like I would say, like for Star Trek, I would actually pick Will Riker's beard, because I think instantly the minute that Will Riker grows a beard, like way more gravitas. So that would be an example of like a way that he presents himself that changes the way other people perceive him. And it's within his entire yeah, it has Will Riker's beard has a lot of power over me as well. It's so impressive, so dark, so neat. So like Will Riker's beard would be a perfect example of something that gives people personal power. Other examples could be like Vulcans and their self mastery over their emotions. Another really good example of a character that has this personal power that shifts and that exchanges depending on the situation, what they're confronted with, is Neelix from Voyager. So, in a lot of ways, Neelix is often presented as very subservient, kind of anxious, worried, maybe a bit goofy. He's like the kind of the guy they picked up along the way. And yet, in situations where he's in defense of something that he really cares about, you see a very different side of him. So you see that kind of fiercer, more confident, more resilient, more determined character. And justice for Neelix is what I'm saying. I think he's one of the more interesting characters aboard Voyager, controversially or not, depending on your own personal things. So what does all of this tell us about a character and the characters that we're writing? A lot of the things that define people's power can be an indication of their status, and it helps us understand a little bit about their backstory as well, and also a little bit about how they might interact with other people in certain situations. So as we've just talked, you've got the different types of power, and some of particularly with informal power, a lot of that will be defined by their socioeconomic class. It'll be defined about where they come from, what their education was, their looks. Like, do they have a level of pretty privilege? Are they uncomfortable to look at? the way that they speak, can they influence people? Are they very articulate, or do they stumble over their words, or do they struggle to communicate? Even down to the choices that they make in how they present themselves. So things like the way they dress, how they approach strangers, and it will also dictate a little bit about their ability to impact the world around them or be impacted by it. If you have a character that's a lot more low status, then big changes will be very frightening to them. And yeah, a really great example in the chat there. Thank you. That like Barclay is a great example of someone who, and you see that shift. Like the kind of uncomfortable in therapy Barclay, the pretending that I'm over it Barclay, and the holodeck Barclay, I would say, are all very different people. But they're all tied into this kind of sense of personal power that he has and how he interacts and gains connection with the ships. Brilliant example. So what kind of looking at power and status does for us when we're writing is it's a real opportunity to look at what can be gained or lost in a situation. So there's also a lot of energy in the scene when you get that exchange of power. Um, as I said before, like your audience and your readers will be watching for those moments subconsciously. They might not even be aware of it. And when those moments happen, you kind of it can really draw you in. And it can also be a perfect moment for exploring something that's happening with that person. So, for example, you might have on an away mission a very young ensign who is very unconfident. And if they have a level of success, that confidence will add to their kind of sense of status and power. And the same if someone gets promoted, maybe above their ability or in a time of crisis, they might have the formal power but might struggle with their personal or informal power. And then you've got somewhere you can go with that. You've got a way of exploring what happens for that character. So how might you represent some of this in your writing? And obviously, I'm sure you'll all be able to think of 100. Like I'm talking to the converted in terms of creativity and like understanding humanity when you talk to a bunch of writers. So I'll kind of skim over this if I can. But you might look at things like body language and their in like internal monologue. Something that can also be interested is the difference between how someone wants to be perceived versus how they think they're being perceived. So that kind of, presenting yourself as this very confident person, but inside someone's having a crisis of faith or crisis of identity. And you might also kind of look at like interactions with your fellow writers. So how are other people responding to your character? What's the like is there kind of something you want from them? Is there something that they want from you? And how does that play out in terms of formal, informal, and personal power? What's the kind of influence you have on each other? And it can be sometimes helpful as a tool to use these kind of lenses out of character to kind of go, okay, what's happening here for our characters? Let's unpick it. Do we think that we can actually have that kind of exchange, or do you think there'll be some sort of impact that we will have on each other? And it can also be a really helpful tool when you're navigating in character conflict. So obviously, none of us want out of character drama or conflict, but conflict is a part of people who are living and working together, like many of our characters do. So kind of using this as a way to step back and analyze what's happening can really help you keep those lines between in character and out of character conflict. And it can also help you decide what direction to take things in and what you might think is actually a natural course for this for your character. Oh, I've skipped ahead. Here we go. So looking at kind of examples of what high status characters might look like. Um, so as I said before, there's the King George example from Hamilton. And he's a perfect example because he comes on stage and he stands very still. He stares down the audience as it happens. And these characters tend to not be afraid because they're the top of, if you think about a high status character being someone who's the top of the kind of their food chain. So they're not afraid to be to be touched or to touch other people. They'll initiate eye contact. They're going to be okay starting conversations. Their body language might be more physically open, so they might actually they might actually kind of walk straighter. They'll take their time going places. They'll walk with purpose as well. They'll also tend to be more confident. They'll finish their thoughts. They'll take their time to reason things out, and they'll usually, but not always, have a more positive outlook on life. And there's a strange thing that happens. There's a this is slightly separate to the drama theory. There's someone who's worked with the Harvard, I think it's the Harvard Negotiation Project, and his name is Brian Fuchs, Fuchs. Very important distinction. And he's worked in a kind of a lot of grassroots negotiations in places like Gaza, and he talks about people who have a lot of power. Thanks, Chris. People who have a lot of power tend to find solutions easier because they're in a kind of more limitless place. They have more resources available to them, so they tend to kind of be able to say, yes, it's all good, so when it's like when the captain panics in a red alert, then you're in a lot of trouble. But usually the captain is the one staying calm, and some of that might be like just putting on a good show. But some of it might be because they have more experience of that kind of situation, and that gives them a level of status. It gives them the gravitas, the competence to carry out their role. There's also something about personal space bubbles. So someone who has high status will also tend to have uh, much larger personal space bubbles. They'll take up space, um, but they also won't be afraid to have people go into those personal space bubbles. So then they're not going to be afraid of interaction with other people. Is kind of the big, or certainly one of the markers of someone who is high status. Maybe there are some exceptions, which we'll get onto those. And again, I've put the example in the PowerPoint so you can have a look at it later. But I won't, for time's sake. I won't play the video now. And then it's wanting to play. There we go. So we look at the other side of the coin for a moment. So looking at those low status characters, and generally these are where I really like to play, because I feel like you have a lot of directions to go when you're starting off at kind of ground zero. So things like body language, they're not going to want to be touched as much. Things are going to be more threatening because the world has a much bigger impact on them, and they have less power and less resources to deal with problems. So they're going to be more risk averse potentially. They're not necessarily going to initiate eye contact. They might not shy away from it where they have it, but they're not necessarily going to seek it out. Body language might be physically closed off or feeling like they need to protect themselves. They're not necessarily going to walk in a straight line. They might even follow kind of directions of other people, or kind of move in a less sort of purposeful way. I would like to say this is not a personal attack on anyone. If you feel like some of this rings true to you, then maybe there's some kind of exploring to do. They might rush as well to their destination because their time is not necessarily their own. I think particularly on a ship, introverts unite. Yeah. Particularly on a ship, you might have. So my one of my favorite characters is a character called Ensign Mercy Morn. She's extremely awkward, notorious for like getting things wrong. Just like, I would say personal power is at an all-time low. And she has a little bit of informal power from like being a science officer, but very little formal power as well. And she will constantly like trip over things. She'll rush. She'll kind of shy away from people. She'll often trip over her words or not be able to finish a thought all the way through. And one of the reasons that happens is because she's sense checking what other people think, because that's really important to this character, to Mercy, because that's the only way she can really get what she wants done from a problem, because she doesn't have the resources available to her that someone who is like the lead science officer might have. And then the other thing is that you'll be quick to give away power as well as a low status character. So you're more likely to give up. You're more likely to get up and give your seat to someone. It's not just about the courtesy of it. It's the fact that you think you will deserve less. Um, and you having someone invade your personal space will feel more threatening. So you could look at this as like introverts, extroverts, but I don't think it's that simple because I think introverts can have a tremendous sense of personal power because it's about knowing oneself. Um, and this is more about how you're behaving in social interactions. Mercy is empathetic. I would say she's very empathetic, but maybe like also very quick to back down from situations. Um, so like if some, she's not going to push if it, she's not going to be the person who senses a problem and necessarily pushes towards a solution, because she doesn't necessarily think she's the best person to do that because other people obviously have more experience or more more gravitas, are just generally better. I think so, and that's where I think personal power is really interesting when looking at character development because it's the bits that you can work on. Confidence, yeah, perfect word. Thank you. You could see me struggling for just that one single word. So you have like so it's and I think that's why it's important to break it down into those three elements because it is beyond just as is this does this person like other people. It's more about what does the group what what kind of faith does the group have in me? What are they giving me that allows me to do my job is a good example. Um versus what do I have in me and what do I give the group and like how can I follow that through? How do I live up to that? uh Lovely. And then I've put a Star Wars example. So I do also love Star Wars. And actually I am GMing a Star Wars sim with Emu. And on that sim happened to play the base commander. So it's a whole different kettle of fish. The Babs Commander Babs is, well, first of all, the name, she's got a job to do. She doesn't have time to use her full name. She walks places, she's very determined, she's got a level of confidence and experience there. Whether or not she feels that internally is the interesting thing that we can explore with those high status characters, is that tug of duty versus personal belief. Um, and the example I've given for this is the R2D2 because I think he's the little robot that could. But again, I'll pop this into the I'll pop the PowerPoint up and people can watch it at their leisure rather than us watching it together now. But there's also something interesting in the filming of this particular scene where you have, you'll often have like lots of high camera levels on low status character versus that kind of straight on camera angle for high status characters, or even characters like cameras from below. Um, Hoth was a brutal battle. I totally agree with you, Paul. We could talk for hours about Star Wars, but now is not the time for that, sadly. But there are of course exceptions to the rule, and we've talked a bit about the kind of introvert extrovert tug. You might misread, like, also I think sometimes people you have what I call in my head the confident introvert, so the person who doesn't necessarily have a lot of power but is really good at pretending that they do. um so there are always characters that break those kind of body language rules, and also the kind of some people will be more likely to see when things are being faked. So looking at kind of interactions between a close friend or a family member, versus someone who's just met this character, they're going to notice different things. And there's a question around how do you explore those as a writer? How do you give people those little clues through the descriptions of your body language, for your characters, so that they can pick up on that as well? And some of that's about internal monologue. Some of that is about I think a lot of people have this thing about metagaming, which of course is a nightmare to navigate. But you've also got that kind of dramatic art. Like there's a level of metagaming which is okay, which is I can see that you're giving me a clue as a fellow writer, so I'm going to follow it, even if even if without that clue I might not have noticed. I think that there's that level of kind of dramatic irony is I think sometimes helpful for when you're looking at these exceptions. And also, of course, you've got the situations where it's like, someone's acting for a specific thing, like that you look away, look at me, you have my attention thing. And then you also have and this is I've included just particularly for because I know we have a lot of sci-fi writers and sims. Um Obviously you've got non-human species where these rules are not going to apply or might even be reversed. So you might have situations where for humans laughing together is bonding, and for Vulcans that's offensive. Or like you've got the Klingons where it's good to be like blustering, and that would and facing a situation head on, and to shy away might be considered um a sign of weakness. And so there's also thinking about how and this can be something that's really, really interesting to explore for people who write alien species, I think. Is that thinking about like what values would my society place on individuals that would make this person high status or low status, or might give someone like a level of personal power or informal power. Those can be like really rich, fertile ground for looking at characters who are non-human. Same for robots, cyborgs, etc. So now I'm going to kind of open it up because we've probably all had enough. Like half an hour of me talking at you is enough, I think. um, so I suppose I just wanted to ask some questions of you all, and feel free to like pop your hand up and we can pass over, or you can do a bit more like pop questions in the chat, or give examples as well. So thinking about times where you've shown how status shows up in characters, I'd love to hear some examples. And also, can you think of a time where power has been exchanged, either lowering or increasing your character's status? Um, and does any of this kind of confirm or change anything about how you might think of your characters in the future? Or are you have you thought of any of those kind of exceptions where your character doesn't conform to what you would consider like a social norm? And also, is there anything that you'd like to take away and try out, having chatted a bit? So we've got one from NC, which is, I think power is really important when you play something like a CO, XO, or a diplomatic officer. Yeah, 100%. And also status becomes really, really important for those characters, because a lot of how their job is done is through like how do how do my fellow crew members see me? So you might have, like, I was thinking when I was writing this panel, I was thinking how interesting it would be to have a CO who is newly promoted and like is having to learn how to be confident, or someone who has been promoted above their ability, and therefore none of their crew actually think that they're competent. I think that would be like really interesting kind of territory to explore. um but you also might have, characters who inspire a lot of faith in other people, like from their crew, or in situations where they're having to negotiate or do that diplomacy. Field promotions, yeah, exactly those kind of situations where someone's promoted outside of a formal training situation, create really interesting character development, I think. Chris, I really like the idea of informal power being used in a formal setting. Those guys don't know SWAT. Yeah, so that's what I like to think of, like the union officers of your ship. Who's the HR rep? Um, like, so like who are those characters who will, who will say the uncomfortable things to the captain when the time comes? Or like who are those characters who can influence the captain in a crucial moment where that needs to happen? Um, Paul, I think you can add power to any situation. It's interesting how different levels of power affect and change the character or even the narrative to a story. Yeah, I agree. I think it's and also power changes all the time. um so like that exchange of power, like, so it's that thing of like, so when I said status versus stasis, No one exists in a power vacuum where their status is the same all the time. It just doesn't happen. Like I go into work and like there are certain things about me that will and about my position within the organization I work in that are very different to how I behave with my friends. So that will change in depending on the situation. And I think it's interesting getting to know your characters in in those different settings because you see different sides of them. Family dynamics on a ship, yeah. Like so I've actually had to work with my mother in an office environment, and it's weird because at home, like she's not really a disciplinarian. We're not scared of her, and at work she's very stern. And so like I can imagine how you would play that out in a kind of like a very hierarchical ship structure. That would be like curious. The change of the family dynamic between centuries. Yeah, that's true. Never work with your spouse. And Dulac, yeah, my wife was my boss when we were students. Yeah, this is what I'm saying. I imagine your wife is still your boss, Dulac, but that's just a little guess. Whether or not she's informally powered now rather than formally might be slightly different. Um, but yeah, it's it's interesting seeing those family dynamics play out, and I think DS9 does a really lovely job, because you're in a setting where there are more families because you are in this space station setting as opposed to a ship setting. So you do see that more family dynamic stuff. And like Chief O'Brien clearly not the highest status person in his quarters. I'm just like obviously and seeing those shifts between like Chief O'Brien on duty versus Chief O'Brien off duty is endlessly entertaining. I've worked with my partner and currently work for my parents. It's not that fun. Yeah, it's weird. It's definitely weird when those kind of social like it's those social groups merge or overlap and get kind of weird and loopy. The dynamic between various species, especially on board like a place like DS9. Yeah, so that's really interesting. That's a really interesting point. And one of the things that I really love in DS9 as well, like, and I think is a really good example of personal power, is the Bajorans' personal faith. So you see, it often plays out where they have this level of resilience and determination when facing overwhelming odds. And that's a great example of personal power in situations, and how faith and like someone like a core part of someone's identity, personal belief, can give characters something that steps outside of what you might expect of them to do in a hierarchical structure. That's really a really great example. And also you kind of against the Kardashians, who are this kind of very almost Romanesque imperial structure, you kind of have that um yeah, that push and pull is really interesting. Do you like the current dynamic for me? The missus is fine. I'm glad to hear it. That's great. And in a different college to her. But next promotion might take me back. So it'd be amusing being her teacher and me being the vice principal. Yeah, that'll be weird. It'll be interesting. You might be able to take something from that and add it to your writing, Dulac. It'll be interesting to see how the power dynamics shift. Yeah, the faith that people like the Bajorans have compared to how the Vorta and the Jem'Hadar have for the Vorta. Oh, that's a really interesting thing to dig into. Uh, yeah, because it's two different types of faith, and I would say one is generative. So the Bajorans' power is like a generative. The Bajorans' faith, sorry, is generative in terms of their personal resilience, whereas the Jem'Hadar's faith uh almost is kind of extractive for them as a species. Like it kind of it puts them in a very specific position with the Vorta. um and yeah, and the changelings, sorry, not the Vorta, you're quite right. Yeah, it puts them in a very position with the changelings. And the, what are they called, is it the Dominion? Yeah, that blind faith versus faith which has been tested. It's a faith of the heart. Sorry, Chris, I couldn't resist. I think how power balance and how quickly it can change is always interesting. Like Stephen King's Misery is such an interesting dynamic. Yeah. And Misery is a good example of, so one of the ways that you can have power shift is information exchange. So people make decisions that might be, how people make decisions that are either like in their favor or working against them, and like put them in different situations based on the information they have at hand. And in Misery you see this kind of like realize it, like over time, this realization of what's actually going on as people learn more information and gather more information about each other. um and with that comes a shift because people start to make different decisions based on the information that they have. um, I love DS9 for the dynamics of Cisco's spiritual leadership and being the CEO. Yeah, that's an interesting thing. And also there's a tug in there. So you can have power clashes and power exchanges with other people. um, but you can also have different parts of your own power kind of structures, in like your internal power structures, go against each other. So there are times where Cisco has to really make a decision between his personal power, which is his faith and position as a spiritual leader, versus his formal power as the CEO of DS9. And seeing those struggles is also where you get some of the really interesting Cisco moments, I think, in DS9, where you start to break down like what's really important for him and how is he going to kind of resolve some of these conflicts, especially in the last season. Yeah, I think the last season for Cisco is, you really see that conflict play out in his like internal landscape, which is very interesting. And a lot of that can happen in writing. We've got this beautiful gift of being able to verbalize people's internal monologue as we're writing and as we're describing characters. And that really gives us, like, I think, um even more kind of ability to draw that out and to work through that in a way that theatre you can't really, because you've got to rely on the actor to tell the story physically. We can do a bit more than that. We can tell the story physically by describing body language and actually say what people are thinking, which is kind of beautiful, really. It's like real fertile ground. It's one of my favorite things is when I'm reading posts where I get to see someone's internal monologue and how they're like processing the information that they're getting and how that informs their decision about, am I going to take a big chance here, or am I going to play it safe? Yeah, it is almost like a diary entry. We get the beautiful gift of very creative diary entries, and this is where like these kind of dynamics can play out beautifully. I think, like at the moment, sorry, I'm going to talk about Mercy again because I'm obsessed. But at the moment I've got Mercy's in a temple, and she's accidentally like tripping on hallucinogenic mushrooms, and is having like a kind of crisis of faith with her hallucination. And it's a solo post, and I do find solo posts difficult to write, so I've been working on it a lot longer than some of the other posts that I've done with other people. um but being able to have that internal monologue, and kind of unpick, what does she think is worth. Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. Yeah, Paul, yeah, Nerdy Up North have a great website where there's some really good short stories, which is the website that Paul's mentioned in the chat. We had someone post a horror story to our site in a diary entry. It's so interesting. There's also something about, where do you have your blindness as a character? So like we've all been in situations where we want to keep something from our boss. So power also presents an opportunity for characters to be blind to certain situations because, are some people trying to keep something from the captain, because they're trying to, like what are the things that people hold back from the powerful, um, is also quite interesting, I think. Yeah, like you might have, and it's one of the reasons I really enjoy Lower Decks, because you often see like you see stuff that's like will never get like never reach the captain's attention, but can sometimes be quite controversial and weird. So yeah, internal monologue can help with a situation of know thyself. Yeah, for sure, for sure, for sure. Um, yeah, yeah, I definitely think it kind of helps unpack that. Does anyone have any like good examples of things? Oh, I can just see the 15-minute warning popping up. So with our last 15 minutes, anyone got good examples of like, or how would you describe your character if you were going to rate them in terms of their like status and power for informal, formal, and personal? Do you have characters that have like a very high level of one, a very low level of the other, or a kind of like equal across the board? Like, how would you break it down for your guys' characters? Yeah, vulnerabilities are shown. That's the beautiful, that's one of the reasons I like low status characters, because you get a lot of vulnerability being low status, and it's where you can really sometimes crack into the heart of a character. The same if you have a high status character that takes a bit of a tumble. um you can kind of, yeah, you get to like dig into that kind of the core human underneath all of the kind of all of the bluster. I've just thought the thing that would be good for an example of status shift: pause. Helicopter pilot becomes chief alien killer. Thanks, Chris. Pause. Taking a pause in a conversation, powerful move. Powerful move can also be a sign of uncertainty. And that's where you get this kind of, there's no hard, fast rule for body language and decision making. And how someone sits in that pause can also be really interesting for sure. I've given Chris too much power. Yeah, I agree, Paul. Way too much power. Time to take it back. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Just I can see other people typing. Any other thoughts before we close? Quietly sitting in the pause. See, this is the other thing. People filling awkward silences instantly. Interesting why people do that. Okay, I'm not okay. let's keep the threats of violence to the DMs, please. um yeah, so I guess like with 10 minutes to go, I'm gonna either close us off, or if there are kind of any last minute questions, feel free to shout out. But what I think we'll do, the dynamic of Frankenstein, the power play God, or should we do it? The power to play God, or should we do it? Yeah. And also in Frankenstein, or rather in Frankenstein, the shift, like that's a great example of a story that takes a high status character who has resources and money and like high education and what seems to be a happy life at the beginning. Something tragic happens. He creates this monster, and through his own hubris you see this tumble because the monster eventually takes it becomes the draws in all of that power, and it kind of, you see that shift and that corruption. Gothic horror is perfect for that kind of thing. You do see that, like Fall in the House of Usher is another example of like characters taking that tumble, and you leave them down at their lowest. But yeah, thank you all very much. What I'm going to do is I'm going to close us off a little bit early. Canterbury Tales follows many different people along their journey, and that's another great example of very different characters being thrown together in that kind of pilgrimage environment. It's a great setting. So I'm going to close us off with 10 minutes because I'm going to say, go get yourself a cup of tea, take a pause, like live in your most powerful self. Um, and yeah, I hope you really enjoy. If there are any questions or anything, feel free to reach out. I will yeah, I'll pop the yeah, if you want to have a copy of the PowerPoint, also reach out and I'll send you a link. Um Wheel of Time. Do you know I've just started reading Wheel of Time. Really loved it. Anyway, sorry, getting distracted again. Go have a cup of tea, take a moment, have a rest, and enjoy the next round of panels because I think the next ones will be good. Um, yeah, so it should be lots of fun. I'm just having a look to see where we're at. Yeah, no, it'll be good. Um, Go to the general chat and you'll be able to see where the next ones are on. Thanks all very much.